The gunshot echoed through the dusty main street of Wood River, Nebraska, making Genevieve Rawlins flinch as she pressed her back against the weathered wall of the general store. The year was 1878, and what had begun as a simple trip to town for supplies had turned into a nightmare when 5 riders thundered in, guns blazing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her face into a mask of calm as the outlaws dismounted and began shouting orders at the terrified townsfolk. Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt. The tallest of the men hollered, his voice carrying the gravel of someone who'd spent too many years breathing trail dust and whiskey. Genevieve clutched her reticule tightly. Fingers curled around the small derringer her father had given her before she'd left St. Louis 3 months ago. It wouldn't do much good against 5 armed men, but the cool metal against her palm gave her some small comfort. The outlaws were moving through the street now, herding people toward the bank, and she knew her hiding place wouldn't conceal her for long. "You there, lady in the blue dress?" One of them had spotted her, his dark eyes locking onto hers from beneath the brim of a filthy hat. Genevieve straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, determined not to show the fear that threatened to choke her. "I have nothing of value," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The outlaw laughed, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "We'll be the judge of that. Get moving toward the bank now." She stepped away from the wall, forcing herself to walk with measured steps despite the trembling in her legs. She'd come west to start a new life, not to die at the hands of bandits in a town barely large enough to warrant a spot on the map. As she joined the huddle of frightened townspeople, Genevieve heard the thunder of hooves approaching. The outlaws heard it too, their heads snapping up in unison as 3 riders came into view at the far end of the street. "It's Eastwood," someone whispered beside her, a mix of awe and relief in their voice. The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop, dust swirling around its legs. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Beside him, 2 other men flanked him, rifles ready but not yet raised. "Jericho," the lead rider called out, addressing the apparent leader of the outlaws, "this doesn't need to go any further. Let these people go and ride out." The outlaw called Jericho spat on the ground. "Eastwood, should have figured you'd show up to spoil the fun. You gonna take on all 5 of us with just 2 men backing you? Wouldn't be the first time I've faced worse odds." The newcomer's voice was calm, almost conversational, but Genevieve could hear the steel beneath. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, with frightening speed, one of the outlaws reached for his gun. What followed was a blur of motion and gunfire that had Genevieve dropping to her knees, hands covering her head. When she dared to look up, 2 of the outlaws were on the ground, one clutching his shoulder and cursing, the other ominously still. The remaining 3, including Jericho, had their hands in the air, their faces twisted with rage and defeat. As the dust settled, Genevieve watched the man called Eastwood dismount in one fluid motion. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to danger, his eyes scanning the crowd until, unexpectedly, they met hers. Something in his gaze caught her off guard, a flicker of recognition, though she was certain they'd never met. The sheriff emerged from his office, looking sheepish for having taken so long to respond, and hurried to help round up the outlaws. As the excitement died down, the townspeople began to disperse, murmuring gratefully to Eastwood and his companions. Genevieve remained frozen in place, her legs refusing to support her weight just yet. The masked calm she'd maintained in the face of danger was beginning to crumble now that the threat had passed. A shadow fell across her, and she looked up to find Eastwood standing over her, hand extended. "Madam," he said simply. She took his hand, noting the calluses on his palm as he helped her to her feet. "Thank you," she managed, her voice finally betraying a tremor, his eyes a startling shade of blue studied her face. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said quietly, so only she could hear. Genevieve blinked, feeling oddly exposed. "I don't know what you mean." "You're scared half to death," he said, his voice matter of fact but not unkind. "But you're trying not to show it. That's brave but unnecessary." A small, unexpected laugh escaped her. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone who knows what to look for." He tipped his hat slightly. Ethan Eastwood, at your service. Genevieve Rawlins, she replied. I'm new to Wood River. I figured as much. Don't think I'd forget a face like yours. The comment wasn't delivered with flirtation, just simple honesty that brought heat to her cheeks nonetheless. Before she could respond, one of his companions called out to him. Ethan, sheriff wants a word. Ethan nodded, then turned back to Genevieve. You going to be all right, Miss Rawlins? Yes, thank you. She managed a smile that felt almost genuine. I should get my supplies and head back to my homestead before dark. Something like concern flickered in his eyes. You're out at a homestead alone. I'm quite capable, Mr. Eastwood. Her chin lifted slightly, pride overriding her lingering fear, never suggested otherwise. His lips curved slightly. But there's more than just outlaws to worry about out here, whether wildlife machinery breaking down. I manage, she said, though in truth the past 3 months had been harder than she'd ever imagined when she'd purchased the abandoned property 10 miles outside of town. I'm sure you do, he nodded thoughtfully. But if you ever need help, my ranch is just north of Cottonwood Creek. Anyone can point you in the right direction. With that, he tipped his hat once more and strode toward the sheriff, leaving Genevieve with the curious feeling that her life in Nebraska had just taken an unexpected turn. 2 days later, Genevieve was struggling with a broken wagon wheel when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her reach instinctively for her father's derringer. She relaxed when she recognized the rider Ethan Eastwood, sitting easy in the saddle of a magnificent chestnut gelding. Miss Rawlins, he called as he approached, seems like you might be in need of some assistance after all. She straightened, brushing dust from her skirts. Mr. Eastwood, what brings you to my homestead? Was riding fence line and saw your predicament. He dismounted, his eyes taking in the broken wheel and the heavy sacks of feed still needing to be transported from town. Appears the Nebraska Territory is determined to test your resolve. It's been testing it since I arrived, she admitted, then gestured to the wheel. The axle split when I hit a rut in the road. Ethan knelt to examine the damage, removing his hat and setting it aside. His hair was darker than she'd realized, a rich brown that caught copper highlights in the sun. This is beyond repair, I'm afraid. You'll need a new one. I suspected as much. She sighed, calculating how much of her dwindling savings a new wheel would require. I've got a spare at my ranch, Ethan said, rising to his feet, and tools to install it properly. Could have you mobile again by tomorrow. Genevieve hesitated, unused to accepting help so freely offered. Incent. Louis, such assistance would have come with expectations she wasn't willing to meet. But out here, where survival often depended on neighbors helping neighbors, she was learning that genuine kindness existed. That's very generous, she said finally. I can pay you, of course. Something like amusement flashed in his eyes. Out here, we don't keep ledgers for neighborly help, Miss Rawlins, but if it makes you feel better, you can invite me to supper sometime. The suggestion was casual, with no hint of impropriety, but Genevieve still felt her cheeks warm. I suppose that would be fair, she agreed, though I should warn you, my cooking skills are still developing. Ethan laughed, a warm sound that seemed to chase away some of the loneliness that had been her constant companion. I've eaten my own cooking for years, Miss Rawlins. Anything you make would likely be a vast improvement. He helped her unload the supplies from the wagon, carrying the heavy feed sacks to her small barn with an ease that spoke of a lifetime of physical labor. As they worked side by side, Genevieve found herself studying him when he wasn't looking the breadth of his shoulders, the confident way he moved, the lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often. You're wondering why I stepped in during the bank robbery, he said suddenly as they carried the last of the supplies. Genevieve started, surprised at his perception. I was, yes. I used to ride with a U.S. Marshal, he explained, setting down a crate of preserves in her kitchen. Learned a lot about tracking outlaws. When I settled here 5 years ago, I made it clear to Sheriff Daniels that I was available if trouble came calling. And does trouble come calling often? Often enough. His expression grew serious, the railroads pushing west. Brings prosperity, but also draws those looking to prey on it. Genevieve nodded, remembering all too well why she'd left St. Louis, how her father's small business had been crushed by powerful men who saw the expansion west as an opportunity for profit at any cost. Men like Clayton Warner, who thought his wealth entitled him to anything or anyone he wanted. "You look far away," Ethan observed, interrupting her dark memories. "Just thinking about how different life is out here," she said, forcing a smile. Ethan studied her for a moment, and she had the unsettling feeling he could see right through her practiced composure. "Different doesn't always mean easier," he said finally, "but sometimes it means better." Before she could respond, he glanced out the window at the setting sun. "I should head back. I'll return tomorrow with that wheel and a few men to help install it." "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood. I'm truly grateful." "Ethan," he corrected gently, "out here formality doesn't survive long against practicality." "Then you must call me Genevieve," she replied. "Genevieve." He said her name carefully, as if tasting it. "It suits you. Strong name for a strong woman." The compliment, simply stated, warmed her more than it should have. "Not so strong that I don't appreciate the help," she admitted. "Accepting help when needed is its own kind of strength." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll be back tomorrow, then." As she watched him ride away, Genevieve felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a flutter of possibility, of connection. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. True to his word, Ethan returned the next morning with 2 ranch hands and a new wagon wheel. They made quick work of the repair, and by noon her wagon was functional again. Genevieve insisted on feeding them lunch, which they accepted gratefully. As they ate, one of the hands, a jovial man named Hank, regaled them with stories of Ethan's exploits. "Should have seen him 3 winters back," Hank said between bites of cornbread. "Blizzard hit hard, and the McAllister family was stranded without firewood or food. Ethan rode out in that storm when no sane man would have left his hearth, brought them supplies, and stayed to help dig them out." "It wasn't that dramatic," Ethan protested, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "Tell that to little Sarah McAllister, who'd have frozen to death if you hadn't carried her back to your ranch wrapped in your own coat," Hank countered. Genevieve watched Ethan's face, noting the flush of embarrassment. "You seem to have quite a reputation as a local hero, Ethan." "I'm just a rancher who tries to be a good neighbor," he said firmly. "Nothing more." But Genevieve was beginning to suspect there was much more to Ethan Eastwood than met the eye. After the men departed, promising to check on her again soon, Genevieve found herself thinking about Ethan more than was prudent. It had been only 3 days since they'd met, yet something about him had slipped past the careful defenses she'd built after her experience with Clayton Warner. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became a regular visitor to her homestead. He always had a plausible reason, delivering a tool she might find useful, dropping off extra vegetables from his garden, offering advice on preparing for the coming winter. But as autumn deepened, Genevieve began to hope that the real reason for his visits might be the same as her growing anticipation of them. They fell into an easy friendship. Ethan helped her mend fences and shore up her small cabin against the approaching cold, while Genevieve shared her books with him, discovering his unexpected love of literature. On one memorable evening, they sat by her fireplace as she read aloud from Dickens, both of them laughing at his colorful descriptions of London society. "You're not what I expected when I first saw you in town," Ethan admitted during one of these evenings, his voice soft in the firelight. "What did you expect?" she asked, curious. "A city woman out of her depth, I suppose." His smile was apologetic. "But you've got grit, Genevieve Rawlins, more than most men I know." The praise made her both proud and melancholy. "Necessity is a powerful teacher," she said. "When I bought this homestead, I knew nothing about farming or animal husbandry or building maintenance. But staying in St. Louis wasn't an option, so I learned." Ethan's gaze was steady. "What happened in St. Louis?" Genevieve hesitated, her fingers tightening around her teacup. She hadn't told anyone about Clayton Warner and his relentless pursuit, about the way her reputation had been systematically destroyed when she refused his advances, about how her father's business had mysteriously lost all its customers until they were nearly destitute. You don't have to tell me, Ethan said, reading her discomfort. We all have parts of our past we'd rather leave behind. It's not that, she said slowly. It's just, I've never spoken about it aloud. Sometimes saying things aloud robs them of their power, he suggested. Genevieve took a deep breath. There was a man, Clayton Warner, wealthy, influential, used to getting his way. He decided he wanted me, and when I refused him, he made our lives unbearable. My father died of a heart attack after we lost everything, and I used what little money remained to come west and start over. Ethan's expression darkened. Men like that are why I left the law. Too often they're above it. You were more than just a deputy to a marshal, weren't you? Genevieve asked, sensing there was more to his story as well. I was a marshal myself for a time, he admitted. Saw too much corruption, too many wealthy men buying justice while poor men hanged. Decided I'd rather raise horses and cattle than keep enforcing laws that only seemed to work one way. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each contemplating the other's revelation. Finally, Ethan spoke again. Warner can't reach you here, Genevieve, and if he ever tried, he'd have me to deal with. The fierceness in his voice sent a shiver down her spine, not of fear but of something warmer, more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. Thank you, she said simply. And somehow, in that moment, those two words carried more meaning than any declaration of affection could have. As winter settled over Wood River, Genevieve found herself thinking of Ethan even when he wasn't present. She caught herself watching for him whenever she went to town, her heart quickening at the sight of a tall figure on horseback, only to be disappointed when it wasn't him. It was during one such trip to town in early December that trouble found her again. She just finished purchasing supplies when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "That's her," a man's voice said. "Clayton Warner's offering $500 to anyone who can persuade her to return to St. Louis." Genevieve froze, her hand tightening on the handle of her basket. She turned slowly to see two rough-looking men watching her, their expressions calculating. They weren't the outlaws from the failed bank robbery. Those men were still in jail awaiting trial, but they had the same predatory look. She hurried her purchases, paid quickly, and rushed to her wagon, feeling their eyes on her back the entire time. As she drove out of town, she glanced back to see them mounting their horses, and her heart sank. They were following her. Genevieve urged her horses faster, but her wagon was heavy with supplies, and she knew they would catch up eventually. Her homestead was still 5 miles away, and she doubted she could outrun them for that long. Her hand slipped into her pocket, feeling for the derringer, but she knew it would be little use against 2 armed men. When they drew alongside her wagon, one on either side, she kept her eyes forward, her face a mask of calm though her heart was pounding furiously. "Miss Rawlins," one of them called, "we'd like a word with you." "I have nothing to say to you," she replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "Mr. Warner is concerned about your well-being," the other man said, his tone falsely solicitous. "He's offering a generous sum for your safe return to St. Louis." Genevieve's hands tightened on the reins. "Mr. Warner can keep his money. I have no intention of returning to St. Louis now or ever." "I'm afraid we're going to have to insist," the first man said, reaching for her wagon. Before his hand could make contact, a shot rang out, kicking up dust inches from his horse's hooves. The animal reared, nearly unseating its rider. "That was a warning," Ethan's voice called from behind them. "The next one won't be." The men wheeled around to find Ethan and 3 of his ranch hands, all armed and looking grimly determined. "This doesn't concern you," one of the men snarled. "Miss Rawlins is under my protection," Ethan said, his voice carrying the authority of his former profession. "That makes it very much my concern." The men exchanged glances, clearly assessing the odds. 4 armed men against 2 made their decision simple. "Warner won't be pleased," one of them muttered. "Warner isn't here," Ethan countered. "And if he's smart, he'll never set foot in Nebraska territory." With reluctant nods, the men turned their horses and rode away, casting dark glances over their shoulders. Ethan rode up alongside Genevieve's wagon. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her hands were trembling on the reins. "How did you know?" Mrs. Peterson at the general store heard them talking. "She sent her boy to find me," He studied her face. You're trying to hide it again. Hide what? Your fear. His voice softened. You don't have to pretend with me, remember? At his words, something inside Genevieve crumbled. The mask of composure she'd worn for so long slipped, and she felt tears spill down her cheeks. I thought I was safe here, she whispered. I thought he couldn't reach me. He can't, Ethan assured her, reaching across to cover her hand with his. Not while I'm alive. The simple vehemence of his declaration made her look up, and what she saw in his eyes stole her breath: determination, protectiveness, and something deeper that made her heart flutter. I can't ask you to fight my battles, she said. You didn't ask, I offered. His hand tightened on hers. Some things are worth fighting for, Genevieve. Later that evening, after Ethan and his men had escorted her safely home and checked that no one was lurking nearby, they sat together on her porch despite the December chill. They'll be back, Genevieve said, voicing the fear that had been growing since the encounter. Or Warner will send others. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Then we'll need a more permanent solution. Short of killing Clayton Warner, I don't see what that could be, she said, only half joking. There are other ways to make a man back down, Ethan said thoughtfully. Especially when his reputation is involved. Genevieve looked at him curiously. What are you thinking? Warner wants you because you refused him, correct? Because you're the one thing his money couldn't buy, she nodded slowly. What if he believed you were no longer available? Ethan suggested, his voice careful. You mean if I were married? Genevieve felt her cheeks grow warm despite the cold. That might deter some men, but Clayton isn't easily discouraged by such conventions. Not just married, Ethan clarified, under the protection of someone with enough influence and connections to make pursuing you more trouble than it's worth. Genevieve studied him, understanding dawning. You're suggesting a marriage of convenience. To you, Ethan met her gaze steadily. I'm suggesting we consider it as an option. I still have friends in law enforcement across several states. My name carries weight with them. If Warner knew challenging me meant potentially facing federal marshals and local lawmen from here to St. Louis, he might reconsider his pursuit. That's a significant offer to make to someone you've known less than 3 months, Genevieve said carefully, her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with fear now. I'm not suggesting we rush to the altar tomorrow, Ethan said, a small smile playing at his lips. But perhaps we could let it be known that we're courting. That alone might give Warner's men pause. Genevieve considered his proposal, aware that what had begun as a practical suggestion was stirring emotions that were anything but practical. The idea of being publicly linked to Ethan, of having a legitimate reason for his continued presence in her life, was more appealing than she wanted to admit. And if Warner still doesn't back down, she asked. Then we reevaluate, Ethan said simply, but at least you won't be facing him alone. The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. Why would you do this for me, Ethan? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to the star-filled sky above them. Because in the 3 months since you arrived in Wood River, you've shown more courage and determination than most people I've known my entire life. Because you faced down armed outlaws without flinching. Because you've built a life here through sheer will and grit. He looked back at her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. And because when I'm with you, I remember what it's like to believe in something good. Genevieve's breath caught at the simple honesty of his words. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, he suggested, rising to his feet. I'll check on you tomorrow. As she watched him ride away, Genevieve realized she didn't need to think about it at all. The prospect of a courtship with Ethan, even one begun as a practical measure, filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with the way her heart lifted whenever he was near. Word spread quickly through Wood River that Ethan Eastwood was courting the new homesteader, Genevieve Rawlins. Their appearances together at church services and community gatherings raised few eyebrows. They were both of marriageable age, both respected in the community, and the fondness with which they regarded each other was obvious to anyone who cared to look. What had begun as a ruse soon developed a momentum of its own. Ethan found reasons to visit Genevieve's homestead, almost daily bringing supplies, helping with repairs, or simply sharing a meal and conversation. Their pretended courtship blossomed into something neither of them had anticipated but both increasingly welcomed. By Christmas, when Ethan invited Genevieve to join him and his ranch hands for a holiday dinner, the line between pretense and reality had blurred considerably. As she sat at his table, surrounded by the warmth of friendship and festivity, Genevieve realized she hadn't felt so at home since before her father's death. After dinner, Ethan led her outside to show her a mare he'd been training, a beautiful palomino with intelligent eyes. "She's magnificent," Genevieve said, stroking the horse's velvety nose. "She's yours," Ethan said quietly. "Merry Christmas, Genevieve." She turned to him in surprise. "Ethan, I can't accept such a gift. She's worth having someone who appreciates her," he interrupted gently. "And you're worth having a horse you can rely on, especially when you're traveling alone." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said, blinking back unexpected tears. "I've never received anything so perfect." In the lantern light of the stable, with snowflakes drifting softly outside, Ethan took her hand. "May I kiss you, Genevieve?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her heart skipped a beat at the request. This wasn't part of their arrangement, wasn't necessary for maintaining the appearance of courtship. This was something else entirely. "Yes," she breathed, her answer hanging in the air between them like a promise. Ethan's lips met hers with gentle restraint, a kiss that spoke of respect and affection rather than passion. But when Genevieve responded, leaning into him with a sigh, that restraint faltered. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that left them both breathless when they finally parted. "That wasn't pretend," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "No," she agreed, her hands still resting on his chest where she could feel his heart racing. "It wasn't." The new year brought both hope and renewed danger. A letter arrived for Genevieve, delivered by the stagecoach driver rather than through the post office. The St. Louis postmark made her hands tremble as she opened it. Inside was a brief note in Clayton Warner's unmistakable handwriting. "Your rustic diversion doesn't change anything. You belong in St. Louis with me. I'll be arriving on the spring stage to remind you of that fact." C.W. Genevieve stared at the note, cold dread settling in her stomach. Warner was coming to Wood River himself. The thought of facing him again, of having him bring his malevolence into the life she'd built, was almost unbearable. She rode immediately to Ethan's ranch, the Palomino mare making easy work of the winter-hardened trails. When she showed him the note, his expression darkened dangerously. "He's more persistent than I anticipated," Ethan said, reading the message again, "and bolder. What do we do?" Genevieve asked, pacing the length of his sitting room. "I won't run again, Ethan. I can't spend my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to appear." Ethan watched her for a moment, then crossed to a cabinet and withdrew a small wooden box. "There's something I need to show you," he said, setting the box on the table between them. Inside was a silver marshal's badge, well worn but still gleaming, and several folded letters bearing official government seals. "I didn't leave the marshal's service under the happiest circumstances," Ethan explained, unfolding one of the letters. "But I left with my reputation intact. These are commendations from governors and judges in 3 territories, testifying to my character and service." Genevieve read one of the letters, her eyes widening at the effusive praise from a federal judge. "These would carry significant weight if there were ever a legal confrontation with Warner," she said, understanding dawning. "More than that," Ethan continued, "they represent connections I can still call upon if needed, men who owe me favors or remember me favorably." He took her hands in his. "Warner may have money and influence in St. Louis, but out here, different currencies hold value." For the first time since receiving the letter, Genevieve felt a spark of hope. "So when he arrives, we'll be ready," Ethan assured her, "but there's something else we should consider." The serious note in his voice made her look up sharply. "What?" Ethan took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. Our arrangement, this courtship, it began as a way to protect you, but these past weeks. He hesitated, then continued more firmly, these past weeks have meant more to me than I can express. Genevieve's heart quickened. They've meant a great deal to me as well. What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, Ethan continued, a rare nervousness in his voice, is that I find myself wishing our courtship wasn't just for show, that it was real with all that entails. The open vulnerability in his expression made Genevieve's breath catch. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Ethan Eastwood? A smile tugged at his lips despite his evident anxiety. I suppose I am, though not very eloquently. He squeezed her hands gently. I love you, Genevieve Rawlins. I think I have since that day in town when you faced down those outlaws with your chin held high and fear hidden behind those remarkable eyes of yours. I'd be honored if you would consider becoming my wife, not for protection or appearances, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Tears welled in Genevieve's eyes, but for once they weren't born of fear or sadness. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling both momentous and utterly natural. And yes, I will marry you for all the right reasons. The kiss that followed was both a seal on their promise and a beginning of something new, something neither had dared hope for when they'd first met. They were married 2 weeks later in Wood River's small church, with the entire community turning out to witness the union. The bride wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, and the groom stood tall in a suit that couldn't quite disguise the strength of the man within it. Their vows were spoken clearly, without hesitation, each word a step further away from the shadows of their respective pasts. As winter gave way to the first tentative signs of spring, Genevieve and Ethan settled into married life with a contentment that surprised them both. They decided to make Ethan's ranch their home, with plans to expand the main house in the summer. Genevieve's homestead would be used as a base for expanding their cattle operation, with one of Ethan's trusted hands living there to oversee the property. But even as they built their life together, the specter of Clayton Warner's imminent arrival hung over them. Ethan made discreet inquiries through his former colleagues, learning that Warner had indeed left St. Louis bound for Nebraska territory. The stage would arrive in 3 days' time. Are you ready? Ethan asked Genevieve on the morning the stage was due. They stood together on the porch of their home, her hand tucked securely in his. As ready as I'll ever be, she replied. The fear was still there. She doubted it would ever fully disappear where Warner was concerned, but it was tempered now by determination and the knowledge that she wasn't alone. Remember, you have nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to fear, Ethan said, his voice firm. You're Genevieve Eastwood now, my wife and partner. Warner has no power over you. She squeezed his hand gratefully. Let's go face him then, together. They rode into Wood River side by side, arriving just as the stagecoach thundered into town in a cloud of dust. Ethan helped Genevieve dismount, then stood beside her as the passengers began to disembark. Clayton Warner was the last to emerge, his expensive clothing immediately marking him as an outsider in the frontier town. He was a handsome man in a cold, calculated way, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to assess everything in terms of its value to him. Those eyes found Genevieve immediately, a proprietary smile spreading across his face. Then he noticed Ethan beside her, noted their clasped hands, and the smile faltered. Genevieve, Warner said, striding toward them with unearned confidence, you're looking well. Frontier life seems to agree with you, Mr. Warner, she replied coolly. May I introduce my husband, Ethan Eastwood? Warner's expression flickered briefly with surprise and anger before smoothing into polite neutrality. Husband, my congratulations, though I must say this is unexpected news. Not to anyone who knows us, Ethan said, his tone pleasant but firm. Genevieve and I have been married for over a month now. Warner's eyes narrowed slightly. How convenient and quick. When you find the right person, Mr. Warner, there's no reason to delay happiness, Genevieve said, meeting his gaze steadily. But I suspect that's a feeling you're unfamiliar with. The barb hit its mark. Warner's jaw tightened perceptibly. I had hoped we might speak privately, Genevieve. For old time's sake. "There's nothing private to discuss," she replied. "And any old times between us exist solely in your imagination." Warner's composure slipped further, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You can't honestly believe this. Frontier justice will keep you safe from me." "Do you know who I am, what I can do?" "I know exactly who you are," Genevieve said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "A man who uses wealth to avoid consequences, who believes everything and everyone has a price. But you're wrong about that, Mr. Warner. Some things can't be bought." Before Warner could respond, Ethan spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once made him an effective marshal. "Mr. Warner, I think we should be clear about something. My wife has no interest in returning to St. Louis or in maintaining any connection with you. Her home is here now with me." Warner's expression darkened. "You don't know what you're involving yourself in, Eastwood." "On the contrary," Ethan replied evenly. "I know exactly what I'm involving myself in. The question is whether you do." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, offering it to Warner. "This might clarify matters." Warner took the paper reluctantly, his face paling as he read it. It was a letter from the territorial governor acknowledging a report from former U.S. Marshal Ethan Eastwood regarding potential harassment of Nebraska citizens by an out-of-territory businessman, and promising full legal support should any issues arise. "This is intimidation," Warner sputtered, thrusting the paper back at Ethan. "No, Mr. Warner, this is protection, legal, legitimate protection of a citizen under my jurisdiction," came a new voice. Sheriff Daniels had approached during their conversation, his badge gleaming in the spring sunlight. "And I'd take it as a personal favor if you'd respect that protection during your stay in Wood River." Warner looked from the sheriff to Ethan to Genevieve, calculation evident in his expression. Finally, he offered a tight smile. "I see I may have misunderstood the situation. Perhaps my business in Wood River can be concluded more quickly than anticipated." "That would be best," Ethan agreed, his arm slipping around Genevieve's waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Warner gave a curt nod, then turned away, heading toward the hotel with stiff dignity. Genevieve watched him go, scarcely able to believe the confrontation she'd dreaded for so long had ended so anticlimactically. "You think he'll give up that easily?" she asked Ethan quietly as they walked back to their horses. "Men like Warner calculate risk versus reward," Ethan replied thoughtfully. "Now that he knows pursuing you means risking his reputation and possibly facing legal consequences, the equation has changed. He may still harbor resentment, but he'll find other targets for his ambitions." Genevieve nodded, hoping Ethan was right. "Thank you for standing beside me." Ethan smiled, a warmth in his eyes that was reserved only for her. "Always, Genevieve, that's what for better or worse means." 2 days later, Clayton Warner departed on the eastbound stage, having conducted whatever legitimate business had brought him to Nebraska with commendable haste. He did not seek out Genevieve again, nor did he send any messages. It was as if, having assessed the situation, he had calculated his losses and moved on. As spring blossomed into summer, Genevieve allowed herself to believe that the shadow Warner had cast over her life had finally lifted. She and Ethan expanded their ranch operations, adding a small orchard and additional grazing land. They converted her former homestead into a comfortable second home where they sometimes stayed when working that part of their property. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, Genevieve turned to Ethan with a smile that held a secret. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat abdomen. "We're going to have a baby." The joy that transformed Ethan's face was something Genevieve knew she would remember forever, the way his eyes widened, then softened, the way his smile grew until it seemed to illuminate his entire being. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "Our baby." "Due in early spring," she confirmed, laughing as he pulled her into a gentle embrace. "Are you happy about this?" he asked, searching her face. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she assured him. "When I came west, I was running from something." I never imagined I'd find so much to run toward. Ethan kissed her then, a kiss filled with promise and the future they would build together. No more running for either of us, he murmured against her lips. Just living and loving and facing whatever comes next side by side. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that had become their home, Genevieve reflected on how far she'd come from that frightened woman who'd tried to hide her fear from outlaws on a dusty street in Wood River. She'd found strength she didn't know she possessed, love she hadn't dared hope for, and a future brighter than any she'd imagined. And it had all begun with a perceptive cowboy who'd seen through her carefully constructed facade and offered the simple gift of understanding. "You don't have to pretend with me." In the years that followed, their family grew along with their ranch. First came their daughter, Emma, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, they welcomed a son, James, whose laughter seemed to chase away even the darkest shadows. Ethan continued to help the sheriff when needed, his reputation as a fair and formidable lawman growing throughout the territory. Genevieve discovered a talent for breeding horses, particularly the Palominos she'd come to love, and established a bloodline that became sought after throughout the West. The specter of Clayton Warner never returned to haunt them. They learned, through Ethan's contacts, that he had overextended himself financially in a series of risky railroad investments and lost much of his fortune and influence. The man who had once seemed omnipotent was rendered ordinary by his own hubris, a footnote in the story of their lives rather than the threat he'd once appeared to be. On their 10th anniversary, Ethan surprised Genevieve with a small wooden box, similar to the one in which he'd kept his marshal's badge. Inside was a delicate gold locket. "Open it," he urged as she admired the intricate engraving. Inside was a tiny portrait of their family, Ethan, Genevieve, Emma, and James, painted by a traveling artist who'd passed through Wood River the previous summer. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. "Just like the life we've built," Ethan agreed, helping her fasten the locket around her neck. "Not without challenges or hard work, but perfect in all the ways that matter." As they stood together under the vast Nebraska sky, surrounded by the home and family they'd created, Genevieve reflected that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it for something worthwhile. She had found that courage within herself, nurtured by Ethan's steadfast belief in her. And together they had built a life neither of them could have imagined that day in Wood River when an outlaw's threat had brought them together. It was a life where pretense had no place, where they faced each day honestly and openly, with all the strength, vulnerability, and love they had to give. A life where, no matter what challenges arose, they faced them as they had from the beginning, side by side, hand in hand, with hearts open to whatever the future might bring.